Good evening, everybody from Jerusalem. Welcome to this series of lectures on the Friday night tefillah as conducted in the Spanish and Portuguese or Western Sephardi style. I was actually wondering whether, in view of developments, whether we have any participants tonight from Abu Dhabi or Dubai online. Never know. Once again, I'd like to thank Ephraim Kathir and the Sephardic Heritage International for organizing this event. And once again, express the hope that you'll find it enjoyable and possibly provide you with insights that will enrich your appreciation, understanding of this wonderful Shabbat evening tefillah. Also, once again, I'd like to thank Nachshon Rodriguez Pereira for preparing the PDF of the tefillah content. Well, to follow on from where we reached last week, we got as far as Lecha Dodi and then we run out of time. So that's where we'll start. Now, following Lecha Dodi, the Hazzan continues with an Agadic or non-halachic passage from the Talmud. In this case, it's actually the very end of Masechet Berachot, in order to introduce the Kaddish de Rabbanan. Now, in this case, the Kaddish de Rabbanan will be recited by Avelim or those who are observing a Nahala. If there are no Avelim present, the Kaddish will be said by the Hazzan. Now, I'm going to return to this subject of who says the Kaddish and why a little later on. But just to begin with, we'll read this passage, Amar Rabbi Elazar, and I'd like you to note that there's a feature which is quite common in the Spanish and Portuguese tradition, where the Hazzan repeats the final phrase of a congregational song, in this case, Lecha Dodi, and leads into a recitative. So he finishes, he begins what he does, repeating the very end of Lecha Dodi, the two words, Boi Kala, and then Amar Rabbi Elazar. So, and the other thing to note here is that it's actually, the motif here is a reprise of the chant that we heard for Bamed Madlikin last week. Okay, so Ephraim, if you wouldn't mind putting on track number 1, Amar Rabbi Elazar.
Boi chala, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Hanina, תלמידי חכמים מרבים שלום בעולם, שנאמר, בכל בנייך לימודי אדוני, ורב שלום בנייך, אל תקרא בנייך, אלא בונייך. יהי שלום בחילך, שלווה בארמנותייך, למען אחי ורעי, אדבר אנא שלום בך, למען בית אדוני אלוהינו, אבקשה טוב לך. ורבנים לבניך, שלום על ישראל, שלום רב לאוהבי תורתך ואין לנו מכשול, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום.
And from there would follow Kaddish. So let's take a few moments now to look at the institution of the Kaddish. The Kaddish is an often recurring item in our liturgy, appearing in many guises, and it sort of punctuates our tefillah. During the course of the Kabbalat, Shabbat, and Arvit services, the Kaddish in varying forms will be recited a total of 5 times. So let's have a look briefly at the different forms of Kaddish. If you wouldn't mind putting up the first slide number 1, Kaddish table, Ephraim. Okay, so let me explain to you what's going on there. What all of these Kaddishim have in common is that they act as markers signaling the conclusion of one of the components of the tefillah. So if we look at the first one, we find Kaddish Le'ela. Now, Kaddish Le'ela, which is sometimes referred to as the Chatzi Kaddish, the half Kaddish, marks a pause or transition between elements within the tefillah. So we'll come on to an example of that shortly, where we'll be reading a Perek Tehillim, and before we begin the formal service, with Barechu, there'll be a Kaddish to demarcate that particular transition. The next Kaddish is on the list is Kaddish Yehesh Shlema Rabbah, which is a Kaddish which marks the end of the Tefillah. And it's generally said following a Tanakhic passage, something which comes from the Tanakh. That's fairly straightforward. The third form of Kaddish is the Kaddish Titkabal, which is said following each and every Amidah. So you will notice in Shachrit, at the end of the Amidah, we have a Kaddish Titkabal. On weekdays, we'll have Tachanun and then Kaddish Titkabal. And so it is with every service. The only time I can think of where we have a Kaddish Titkabal where there is actually no Amidah as such is during Selichot, where at the end of the Selichot, a Kaddish Titkabal will be said. But it basically is an entreaty to the Almighty to accept the prayers which we have just offered. And the final form of Kaddish on the list is the Kaddish de Rabbanan. And as you might expect, it's a Kaddish which follows a Talmudic reading. And it needs to be specifically an Agadic reading. In other words, not an halachic reading, but a reading which has to do with either a story or which wishes to convey some type of message to us in a non-halachic sense. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the function of the Kaddishim. There are others which are said on very, very specific occasions, like the completion of a Masechet of the Talmud at a Siyum, or Rachok Meitanu at a Bet HaKvarot. But these, by and large, are the standard Kaddishim which we come across pretty much every day, several times a day. Okay. Now, I'm sure that most of you have heard and perhaps know that the Kaddish is, for the most part, in Aramaic. Now, a substantial part of the various Kaddish formulae are actually, to a greater extent than you might expect, in Hebrew. If you'd like to put up the next slide, please, Ephraim, the one that's called Hebrew in the Kaddish, and I've tried to sort of, there we go, all those colors there sort of tell you what's going on. Just to give you the color key there, I hope you can all see it clearly. Where there is no highlighting, that's Aramaic. Hello, oh, it's gone. The yellowish sort of golden color highlighting is where the words are in Hebrew. And the blue is an interesting phenomenon. It's where the words are in Hebrew, but are pointed and pronounced as if they were Aramaic. We'll start at the beginning. Yit Gadal V'Yit Kadash. Okay, Yit Gadal V'Yit Kadash is Hebrew, but it really should be Yit Gadel V'Yit Kadesh. And I'm sure many of you have encountered, particularly in Yekish Minyanim, that people saying Kaddish actually will say Yit Gadel V'Yit Kadesh, because that conforms precisely to the canons of Hebrew grammar. Most people have adopted the Aramaic style of pronunciation, albeit on Hebrew words, and say Yit Gadal V'Yit Kadash. So we continue. Shemei Rabbah. Be'alma diverach yiruteh v'yamnich malchuteh v'atzmach kurbaneh v'kareb meshicheh. Now, everything there is in Aramaic except we got up to V'yatzmach, and then the Kaddish continues. Bechayechon u'gomechon u'chayeh. Bechol Bet Israel is in Hebrew, and Ve'imru Amen is also in Hebrew. Then the second paragraph, which now I should point out, the second paragraph is what perhaps is the central feature, the ikar, the principle of the entire Kaddish. Yehei Shemei Rabbah Mebarach le'alam le'almeh almaya yitbarach, which is well, may God's great name be blessed forever and ever. This is really the central core theme of the entire Kaddish. And this is said in Aramaic. And I'll explain to you a little bit why that particular thing is said in Aramaic in just a moment. And then it continues again. You can see the blue. Again, we have the same phenomenon. Again, it's Hebrew, but it's pointed as if it were Aramaic. And then the rest of the paragraph, except for Imru Amen, Aramaic. The section Al Yisrael Ve'al Rabbanan is entirely in Aramaic until we get to Ve'imru Amen. The final paragraph, Yehi Shlamar Rabba Min Shemaya, is all in Aramaic, is all in Hebrew except for those first 5 words and the word Shezabah. It's actually the Hebrew, the Aramaic for the Hebrew Hatzlacha, success. And Oseh Shalom, Kamuvan, is in Hebrew as well. So, in fact, I didn't actually do a precise calculus of this, but you can see a very hefty portion of the Kaddish is actually in Aramaic. Now, as to why it is in Aramaic, well, there are various schools of thought, and there is, in fact, a school of thought which says that originally the whole thing was in Hebrew, but translated into the vernacular in order that people who were Aramaic speakers at the time could understand this very, very important prayer. That's one theory. Another theory is more Kabbalistic in orientation. There is this idea that the Malachim, the angels, who minister to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, were very jealous of their position. And one of the things, of course, that we know that they say to exalt HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the phrase which we say twice a day in the Shema, but in an undertone, Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. And the reason that we say that in an undertone, except on Yom Kippur, is because we don't want to upset the Malachim by it appearing that we've taken one of their lines and are using it ourselves to offer our praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, for that reason, that same idea which is conveyed in Yehi Shemei Rabba Mevarach is said in Aramaic, which is a language apparently that the Malachim do not understand. So there's a bit of subterfuge going on over there. Okay. Now, that covers the language of the Kaddish. Now I'd like to move on, if I may, to something of the background, historical background. The first reference we have to the Kaddish in our sources appears in the Tanaitic period around the year 200 of the Common Era. And it appears in the Sifri, which is a commentary on the book of Devarim, on the parasha of Ha'azinu. And the question that's asked in the Sifri is, Uminaim yehe sheme Rabba Mevarach. Or Yehi Shemei Rabba Mevarach. Where does the expression Yehi Shemei Rabba Mevarach derive? And the answer that's given in the Sifri is from the self-same parasha Ha'azinu, Hishem Hashem Ekra, Abu Godel Lelohenu. So there's a pasuk in Ha'azinu which says, for we shall call upon the name of God and ascribe greatness to our God. So that's the first reference. The first mention of the word Kaddish comes a little bit later. And the reference we find to that is in Masechet Sofrim, in a discussion of which prayers require the presence of a minyan in order for them to be said. And the Kaddish numbers amongst them, in addition to Kedusha and various others, which is a topic for another discussion. But that's the first time the word Kaddish appears in any of our sources. That's the 6th century. Now, at around the same period, in the Gemara of Sotah, which those of you who want the reference would find on Lamed Tet Amud Aleph, there is a discussion which mentions the phenomenon, the liturgical phenomenon of reciting a Kaddish at the end of an Agadic discourse, which is what, in fact, we have just done. And the first time that comes up is, again, around the 6th century in the Gemara Sotah. Now, it wasn't until perhaps a little bit later on, during the Gaonic period, which is a 400-year slice of time between around 600 and 1050, that the Kaddish came to be established as part of the synagogue services. Up until now, it's been something that was done in the context of study. But it became a feature of synagogue services in a period somewhat later. Sometime probably after the year 600, but before the year 1000. So somewhere in that period there. Now, the most commonly thought of aspect of the Kaddish is the custom of Avelim saying the Kaddish at the end of the service. Now, this did not, in fact, become widespread until quite late on. It was probably at the end of the 13th century, or sometime during the 13th century, that became established as a practice. And this may well have been in response to the violent and often murderous persecutions that were taking place during the Crusades in certain parts of Europe during that period. And the first published source we have for the Avelim saying Kaddish at the end of the service is in a volume called Or Zarua, which was compiled in Vienna in the 13th century. Now, very soon after this particular practice became established, that Kaddish at the end of the service became known, particularly amongst Ashkenazim, as the Kaddish Yatom, the orphans Kaddish. Now, this, by virtue of that label, gave rise to a widespread misunderstanding, which persists in many places even until today, which is that the Kaddish is some type of mourner's prayer. And there are places, and I've encountered this, and perhaps you have too, where they will only say the Kaddish if there is indeed an Avel present, if there is a mourner present. Otherwise, they'll say, oh, there's no Avel, we skip it, let's go on to the next thing. And to my mind, this is a classic case of putting the doctrinal cart before the liturgical horse. There is absolutely no sense in that particular practice. But every time I've tried to argue the point, I've lost the battle. There has not been one occurrence where I have succeeded in persuading those who adhere to this particular practice to abandon it in favor of the one that actually is enshrined in halakha and logic. Now, that leads on to another very interesting point, that in the Western Sephardic tradition, I'm speaking here, I think, of the Spanish and Portuguese. I don't think it applies to Gibraltar, but certainly it's a very well enshrined Spanish and Portuguese custom in Amsterdam and in New York, sadly not any longer in London, where waves of immigration from non-Spanish and Portuguese locales have resulted in a certain amount of, what should we call it, doctrinal vandalism, liturgical vandalism to the tradition. Anyway, I say that somewhat lightheartedly, not altogether. So the tradition in the Spanish, the old tradition in the Spanish and Portuguese world, and you can see this in the rubrics and their prayer books very clearly, is that they're on Shabbat and Moadim, because of the prohibitions on any sign, any public sign of mourning, the Avelim are discouraged, indeed prohibited, from reciting these Kaddishim. So they would be said instead automatically by the Hazzan, and in certain cases, which I hope we'll get onto in a future lecture, they will actually be sung by the congregation as a whole. Now, it's interesting. The Kaddish that we just referred to, the Kaddish de Rabbanan, is in fact the last Kaddish before Shabbat to be said by Avelim. And the reason that it's said at that point by Avelim is because Shabbat hasn't really started. So it's their last chance saloon of the evening to say a Kaddish. Okay. Now, before moving further, I'd like to say a little bit about the counterparts to Kaddish, our Kaddish, in Christianity. And it's worth pointing out that the concept and even some of the wording of the Kaddish does indeed have a counterpart in Christianity. If you look at an early Aramaic version of the Lord's Prayer, you will find the phrase, Abuna Ishmaya Yitkadash Shemach, which is totally lifted from the Nusach of our Kaddish. Quite remarkable. And the concept of the doxology, which in many Christian groupings follows the Jewish custom when it is said following the reading of or singing of sacred texts, such as Psalms, we find the phrase Gloria in secula seculorum. And of course, the idea of God's glory lasting forever and ever is the same sentiment that's expressed in Yehi Shemeh Rabba Mevarach Le'alam Le'almei Almaya Yitbarach. Okay, so that concludes our analysis of the history and the language of the Kaddish, limited though it was, but I think it's important just to sort of lay some groundwork for what we're about to do later. But we'll leave the discussion of the Kaddish there for a moment and proceed to the next item in the Friday night service, which does mark the beginning of the formal evening service. And that is, or at least it is an introduction to that that beginning. It's a bit complicated. There's actually two schools of thought. Where does Arvit begin? Does Arvit begin with the Psalm, in this case, Mizmor Leyom HaShabbat, or does it begin with Baruch Hu? So if we go according to the opinion that says it's Mizmor Leyom HaShabbat, this is the beginning of Shabbat. And this is where we ourselves can be mekabel, we can accept Shabbat at that very moment. Now, what you're about to hear is the London and Amsterdam version, which are pretty much identical. They're sung in the same psalmodic mode, which is one that we heard last year when we listened to Habul Hashem B'nai Elim. And just for those of you who've got this a musicological interest, the feature here is that it begins on the fifth note of a minor scale and resolves to the tonic. Anyway, if we could just play track 2 now, Ephraim, Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbat. And it'll give me a chance to rest for a couple of minutes.
מזמור שיר ליום השבת, טוב להודות לאדוני, וזמר לשמך עליון, להגיד בבוקר חסדך, ואמונתך בלילות, עלי עשור ועלי נבל, עלי היגיון בכינור, כי שימחתני אדוני בפעולך, במעשה ידיך ארנן, מה גדלו מעשיך אדוני, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך, ישפט לא ידע, וכסיל לא יבין את זאת, בפרוח רשעים, כמו עשב, ויציצו כל פועלי אבן, להישמד עמדיהם, ואתה מרום, לעולם אדוני, כי הנה אויביך, אדוני, כי הנה אויביך יאבדו, יתפרדו כל פועלי אבן, ותרם כרעם קרני, בלותי בשמן רענן, ותבטני בשורי, בקמים עלי מרעים, תשמע לאוזני, צדיק כתמר יפרח, כארץ בלבנון יזכה, שתולים בבית אדוני, בחצרות אלוהינו יבריחו, עוד ינובון בשיבה, דשנים ורעננים יהיו, להגיד כי ישר אדוני, צורי ולא עוולת בו.
Well, the next piece I want to play for you is something of a curiosity. I'm grateful to my friend Jonathan Greenstein for pointing this out to me. Jonathan Greenstein, not only a good friend, but the musical director of the Kolotai Snoga Singers. So this he drew my attention to this rather startling musicological nugget. The English composer Sir Edward Elgar believed that this particular chant was the very one that the Levites sang in the temple in Jerusalem. And so he appropriated it for his setting of the morning psalm in his oratorio, The Apostles. Now, although any claims to its Levitical provenance might be a tiny bit speculative, what is beyond doubt is that the melody is one of great antiquity. So I'd just like to play you a small excerpt from this, and I think you will be quite amazed at how close, melodically, his composition is to what you just heard. So if you could just play, Ephraim, track 3, Elgar, Psalm 92. Okay. So that is the again. I still, as I listen to it, I'm quite amazed at how tone for tone, pretty much, he took the music right out of the score maintained by the London congregation. Okay, moving on to the next item, which is Hashem Malach, which is the companion psalm, which we discussed last week as part of the Kabbalat Shabbat. What I decided to do for this was to play you the New York version of this psalm. And this differs from the London and Amsterdam version in a rather striking manner. And I'll explain it to you in words, and I'll try and give you a little bit of an example. The caesura, which divides the clauses in each of the verses, which we call an atnach or an etnachta, is on the 5th rather than the 2nd note of the scale. And doing that evokes a very medieval type of sound, almost a sort of Gregorian type of effect. So if I can just give you an example of what I mean. Yeah. So in the London version, you had Tov lehodot l'Adonai, uzameh l'shimcha elyon lehagid b'boker chastecha, la 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 lam. Whereas in this one, what you're going to have is da 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 dum, da dee 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 dum, da dee da dum, ba bum bum bum. Instead of da dee da dum bum 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 bum. Da 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 da, which is quite an amazing phenomenon, really, because I've encountered this nowhere else in the Sephardi world, not in the Spanish and Portuguese world, and not in the Dot of Mizrach, and not amongst the North African communities. It would be nice to think that this was some type of artifact, musical artifact, actually secreted out of pre-expulsion Spain, but I have my doubts about that, and it's probably the invention, albeit an inspired one, of a 20th century transcriber and arranger of the choral music in the New York community. Anyway, if we could just play now, please, track number 4, Ephraim, Hashem Malach.
Adonai Malach, Gehut Labesh, Labesh Adonai Ozit Azar, Achtikon Tebel Baltimot, Nachon Kis'acha Me'az Me'olam Ata, Nase'u Ne'arot Adonai, Nase'u Ne'arot Kolam, יספו נהרות טוב ים, מקולות מים רבים, אדירים משברי ים, אדיר במרום אדוני, אלוהיך נאמנו מאוד, לביתך נאה בקודש, אדוני לאורך ימים.
Thank you. So now, having completed that psalm, we're going to say a Kaddish Le'ela. Now remember, Kaddish Le'ela is the Kaddish which demarcates a transition. So we've finished the introductory psalm portion of the Tefillah, and we're now going to proceed to Barechu, which in some way is the formal beginning of the Arvit. Barechu et Hashem HaMevorach. We're going to be blessing together the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and so the service will start. So this Kaddish, on a normal Shabbat, is it's one of these musical curiosities, and it's performed with only small variations across the whole Spanish and Portuguese diaspora. And in contrast to the more festive counterparts, which we'll come on to in just a while, here what you have is a melody of which is driven really by the sense of the words in the Aramaic text. And the thing that I think one can compare it to most readily in musical parlance is plain song. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Ephraim, please, to play the plain song Kaddish, and then we'll discuss some features of that when that's over.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, אמן. ועל מה דיברה חינותי, וימליך מלכותי, ויצמח פורגני, ויקרב משיחי. בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם לעולם היה יתברך. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם לעלמי עלמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה, שירתה, תשבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. ברכו את עמוני המבורך. ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
So, the features that you will have heard in that Kaddish which are associated with plain song are the following. The melody is free-flowing and the chant moves up and down by small steps within a fairly narrow range. It's monophonic, meaning that there is no harmonies. And the third thing is that there's no fixed rhythm. And so it is with plain song. And just to give you a basis for comparison, there's a very short excerpt that I'd like to play, which is a version of the Lord's Prayer, an excerpt of the Lord's Prayer, which has a plain song basis. So if you wouldn't mind playing, Ephraim, track number 6. Okay, so there you can see, the melody is not the same, but the genre is very, very similar. And again, it attests to the antiquity of that melody. The question being, of course, who got it from whom? And it's very likely that the plain song that was developed in the early church took its music from Jewish prototypes, which it would have learned from temple times. Anyhow, moving on to a discussion of the Kaddish as it's sung on festive occasions, which would mean a Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, or a Shabbat Chol HaMoed, or actually a Yom Tov itself. There are several, there's a range of melodies that can be used, and at one time, the Hazzan might have been called upon himself to compose them or to find them from other traditions and introduce them. Today it's pretty much fixed, and the chances of being able to introduce a new melody are very, very small, Spanish and Portuguese communities being very conservative. But I'd like to, I think we're sort of, let me give a couple of examples. I'm not going to play everything that I'd planned because I don't think we've got time for that. What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about perhaps what is the best, one of the best loved and one of the best known melodies in the Spanish and Portuguese repertoire, which goes under the name Hallel d'Italia. This is a melody for the Hallel, which seems to have originated in Italy, and variants are to be found all over the Spanish and Portuguese world. In fact, outside the Spanish and Portuguese world too, generally in the Western Sephardi diaspora. And in addition to being a melody for Hallel, it serves also as a setting for Ein Keloheinu and, of course, the Kaddish. Now, the first examples of this that I'd like to play are the versions sung in Gibraltar and in London. And this is set up in the form of a medley, which was scored for Hazzan and chamber orchestra by my dear and very talented friend Raymond Goldstein. It opens with the Gibraltar variant and segues into that of London. So could you play for me, Ephraim, track number 9, track number 9, It Gadal Halel d'Italia. Okay, so there you had the Gibraltar version of the Hallel d'Italia followed by the London version. And of course, Gibraltar and London have a relationship over many centuries now, Gibraltar being a crown colony of the United Kingdom. So it's not really surprising that there should have been a movement of melodies from one community to the other. But there's a community where I wouldn't have expected this Hallel d'Italia to have turned up. And this is a North African community, the port city of Oran in Algeria, which is a city with an international ambiance with merchants visiting from across the Mediterranean. Now, this particular community has a version of this Hallel d'Italia, which must have been brought in by a visiting Hazzan, or perhaps even a merchant who was asked to lead the services one Shabbat, and it became a fixture of the local repertoire. Now, although it differs from the London and the Gibraltar versions that you've just heard, its family resemblance is unmistakable. So if I could ask you, Ephraim, please to play track number 10, Gadal Oran. Okay, and now we'll move on to the last offering for this evening, which is Yehei Shemei Rabbah. Now, the melody for this second part of the Kaddish will invariably be substantially different from the melody of the preceding Yitgadal. Once upon a time, it was likely part of the artistic skill exercised by the Hazzan to ensure that the two components of the Kaddish were musically compatible. Today, for the most part, these pairings are pretty much fixed, with little room for innovation. I myself introduced, during my tenure as Hazzan at the Yad Harav Nisim synagogue here in Jerusalem, a melody for Yehei Shemei Rabbah that was lifted from somewhere else. And I've subsequently sung it on a couple of occasions at the Lauderdale Road Synagogue in London. It's based on the melody for the piyut Kamti Lehalel, which is sung in Amsterdam to a melody that's actually only known in Amsterdam, which I learned from my dear friend and teacher, Hazzan Abraham Lopez Cardozo. So, Ephraim, if you wouldn't mind playing, please, track number 12, Yehei Shemei Kamti.
יהא שמך רבה מברך, לעולם על מיה יתברך, וישתבח ויתפאר, ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתהלל, שמלך קודשא בריבוד, לעילה מן כל ברכתה, שירתה, תשבחתה בנחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא, ואמרו אמן.
Short and sweet. Well, that brings us to the end of my remarks for this evening. If you have any questions or discussion points, the floor is now yours.
Your Oran melody, I have heard it in the Rodesli community of Seattle in Musaf of Shabbat, Keter Yitinu Lecha.
Really?
Really?
Ah, that I do find surprising. And gosh. So if I was to speak to Hazzan Azuz, he would be able to help me with that.
Oh, I'm quite sure he would.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I will do that.
I recognized it immediately.
That's amazing. That is really amazing. Thank you. Just let me ask you a few questions. Do you find that, when I was trying to think about the format for this particular series of lectures, I was a bit concerned that, having one melody following the next might be a little bit sort of overwhelming and leave you all at sea musically at the end of, the 45 minutes, an hour. But I can't think of a better way of doing it. But of course, you can always go back and listen to the recording if you want to, if there's something that piques your interest. Gosh.
I mean, it is a lot, but it also blends together in a way that those of us who have, at least what I find is something to anchor it to.
Yeah. I think that is important. It does help a great deal if you've actually experienced this type of tefillah. You get a much, you have a compass to work with. Yeah.
But as I noted last week, there are some substantial points of convergence, but also some very substantial points of divergence from the Sephardi community that I know, which was from Seattle.
Right. I myself, actually, I'm sort of in some ways ashamed to admit this, but my father, Alav Shalom, was born on the island of Rhodes, so I'm a son of a Rodesli, but I never got to know that particular tradition, the musical tradition, in any great detail, which I'm sad about.
Hello.
Hello.
Am I heard?
Yes, you are.
Johnny, hi. I just want to say, first of all, I really enjoyed it.
Oh.
And I don't know if people are aware that one of the pieces you took was from your collection of music, Kamti Hallel. Are people aware of it? That's all I'll say. If people don't know about this collection, I have no idea if it's available, but it's a fantastic double CD set of music produced by, was it Betat Futsot, right?
Correct.
Is it available?
I'm not sure, to be truthful. It's not available on Amazon any longer. They may still have the odd copy at Betat Futsot, but unfortunately, as you know, Betat Futsot decided to rid itself of its music department. So things are in a bit of a state of disarray there. But it's something I'm going to look into. So you're the second person actually this week, Johnny, who's asked me to do that. So I'm going to.
Well, shkoyach anyway. It's a great collection, and well done for tonight.
Well, thank you. What I'm thinking of doing, as far as that is concerned, is if we can find permission to do it, is to put it online. To have people download it.
Sorry, am I allowed to say shkoyach?
Oh, by all means.
I mean, it's not smashing Portuguese or anything. Well done.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Gregory. I actually follow the Spanish-Portuguese Nusach, and when I can, I do pray in Philadelphia. I believe you and I are also in a few common Facebook groups. So I actually really like the historical perspective that you're providing with this. It helps me kind of understand the prayers better, and also the particular way in which we sing them better. So I want to say I really enjoy the extra perspective that you're providing.
Thank you. I was going to say that as far as this innate conservatism of the Spanish and Portuguese, there are two examples that suddenly come to mind. There was a Hazzan in London by the name of Abraham Benisso, who was also a teacher of mine. I don't know whether anybody amongst you has heard of him, but he was one of the greats, and he was the Hazzan in Bevis Marks between 1946 to 1953, and he tried to innovate and got nowhere with it. Only on his subsequent visits to London, he threw in bits and pieces that he put together from Gibraltar, and he knew he could get away with it then because he wasn't on the payroll any longer. But he was a wonderful guy. A small story about him is that when he was at Bevis Marks, his actual title during that period, 46 to 53, was assistant Hazzan. And he often told me that in all his time with the congregation, he never found out who he was supposed to be assisting. Anything else? Anything else I can help you with? Take advantage of this opportunity. Well, let me say this. I've enjoyed this very much, and I'm looking forward to our next week's session, where I'll be looking at the Kriyat Shema and the Tefillah. In other words, we'll be moving on from exactly where we've reached, the Kaddish and what happens after that, some of the recitatives that are involved, some of the melodies, and hopefully we'll get to the end of the Amidah by the end of next week's session. Anyway, thank you all very much for attending. Wish you a good afternoon, good evening, good night for those of us that are in this part of the world.
Good morning for me. Yes.
Sorry?
In my part of the world, it's morning. So good morning.
You're in Seattle?
I am in Eugene, Oregon.
Oh, okay.
Not too far. Yeah.
Not too far on the West Coast. Wow. Okay. Good morning to you.
Thank you. And thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you everyone for joining us for Shindisi's Kabbalat Shabbat series with instructor Hazzan Daniel Halfon. And we'd also just like to thank also our co-host, the United Congregation of Israelites, Sha'arei Shalom in Jamaica. And I just want to let you know that the recording of class number 1 is on the class page, along with the materials for today's class. And so we look forward to seeing you each Sunday, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in the US and Canada, 6 p.m. in the UK, and 8 p.m. in Israel. And so, and remember, if you have any questions between classes, you can email Hazzan Daniel at danielhalfon@shindc.org. And so thank you so much, Hazaku Baruch, Hazzan Daniel, and also hope to see you all at the 3 p.m. Class, Learn to Chant the Torah according to the Western Sephardi Melody of London. And so thank you very much, and see you again soon, God willing.
Bye. Thank you
Shavua
very
tov
much.
v'chodesh tov.
Shavua tov, mevorach, chodesh tov.
Shavua tov, yeah.